People are really angry about the prices of things, whether it's a McDonald's hamburger, whether it's a dozen eggs at the grocery store, whether it's gasoline prices. The 20% inflation since Biden's come into office, that's not gone away. People are poorer today than they were, 3.5 years ago. I guarantee you the 95% of the people who've been really hammered by the inflation tax have incomes below $400,000.
I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Moore. He is a senior visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation and a former economic advisor to President Donald Trump. Steve helped craft the Trump administration's tax policy, which led to the 2017 tax cuts from 2005 to 2014. He was the Wall Street Journal's senior economics writer and a member of the WSJ's editorial board. He's written several books, his latest being Govzilla, How the Relentless Growth of Government is Devouring Our Economy, with Senator Rand Paul. And his upcoming book, which we'll discuss a bit more today, is called Trump Economic Miracle. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure, and congratulations on the success of your show.
Well, thank you very much. It's because of great guests like yourself that we've had a good program that grows. I'd like to talk about the economy first before we talk about your book, your upcoming book that's coming out in September. There's been talks of whether or not the Fed should issue an emergency cut. This has been a widely discussed topic this week. Several Fed governors actually came out and said that they're expecting some sort of action, where they should be having some sort of action soon. What's your take on this issue?
Well, a lot has changed this week. I mean, first we started the week with a meltdown in the stock market, and then that followed the bad jobs report we got on Friday. And I do think the economy is definitely slowing down. I don't think there's any question about that. But I don't believe necessarily that we're going to go into recession. But then the stock market really has rebounded over the last several days. And so when it comes to whether the Fed should lower rates, I think they will lower rates in September. It'll be a quarter or 50 basis point reduction. But I don't think I have maybe an unorthodox view on this, but I think there's way too much obsession on Wall Street about whether the Fed's going to reduce rates or increase them or keep them the same. When in fact, the Fed mostly follows the rates of the market. It doesn't set the rates in the market. And so I don't think the problem with our economy right now is solvable by the Fed. I mean, the fact that we're borrowing $2 trillion, I think everyone understands, is a natural and national disaster, and it cannot continue. And that's not something the Fed can do anything about. They just have to accommodate the spending by issuing bonds and by printing money. So I think we have a lot that's problematic with our economy right now, but I don't think the Fed is the answer.
A lot that's problematic with our economy. What would you say are the biggest problems, if you could break them down?
Oh, the government is way, way too big right now. We should be spending, instead of $7 trillion, we should be spending about $5 trillion. So we should be dramatically downsizing our government. The government should do the essential things that it needs to do, but we're wasting hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars on green energy programs. We are still, we have hundreds of billions of dollars we haven't spent and we don't need to spend that were, appropriated during the COVID era. Well, COVID ended 3 years ago. We have whole agencies of government that are useless, like our Department of Education, which has had no impact on school performance. So there are so many ways we could cut this budget. I estimate there's about $300 to $500 billion of corporate welfare that it's not the government's business responsibility to be providing welfare payments to big companies like the chip makers. So there's plenty of room to cut the spending. And I think, every time you liberate a dollar from government, that's more money that can go into the much more productive private sector.
Americans, it's been cited in polls that Americans are still concerned about inflation, despite the inflation rate having come down from 9.1% at its peak to now 3%. Core inflation stands at 3.3, headline at 3.1. What would you say are sort of the priorities of the government if they want to maintain a lower inflation rate into the next administration? What should they do?
We have to cut government spending. And remember, the reason that we saw the inflation rate go from less than 2% when Trump was president to 9% under Biden is that he came into office and spent and borrowed $4 to $5 trillion. And so how was that accommodated? By printing money. And it's just a simple rule of economics that inflation is too many dollars chasing too few goods. And we had the classic case of that in 2021 and 22 and 23. But you're right, sir, that the inflation rate has come down quite a bit. And so we're probably at a little bit low 3% inflation right now, actually, if you follow what's going on with the commodity markets. So I kind of think we've moved into a new phase where inflation is still a bit of a problem, but not much of a problem. I think I'm much more worried about, whether we're going to see, the slowdown in the economy and people starting to lose their jobs. The employment situation certainly has deteriorated. But look, people are really angry about the prices of things, whether it's a McDonald's hamburger, whether it's a dozen eggs at the grocery store, whether it's gasoline prices. I mean, as you know, the 20% inflation since Biden's come into office, that's not gone away. It just means it's not increasing much anymore. So the level of anger that people feel at the gas pump and at the grocery store and when they pay their rent or where they pay their electricity bills is palpable. And the reason people are so angry is that the prices have gone up by 20%, but the wages and salaries have only gone up by 16 or 17%. So people are poorer today than they were 3.5 years ago.
So we talked. You mentioned the deficit being a problem. The current deficit stands at roughly. There's a roughly $1.7 trillion. It's projected to widen by the CBO. Now, if we're to bring the deficit down towards zero, or just even as a lower percentage of GDP, will we do so at the expense of GDP growth, Steve?
Well, that's a good question because, GDP, what we should be interested in is private sector GDP, not, and I've always thought that it's a mistake to even include government in GDP so by definition, yes, if you cut government spending, the GDP will be reduced because government spending is part of GDP, but government, for the most part, doesn't add much productive value to our society. And so, especially when you get above a certain, of course, we need a national defense. Of course, we need border security. Of course, we need police and fire services and schools. But most of the money we're spending now isn't going to those kinds of productive things. And so I do believe there's a great value added to our country to reducing the spending, as I said, in a very dramatic way. But at least we should make sure that spending is not going up faster than economic growth. In other words, we want to make sure that the public sector is growing at a slower pace than the private sector. And for the last several years, that has not been the case, especially when you look at the employment situation. If you look over the last year, the two biggest employers in terms of increasing hiring have been healthcare and government. So in other words, we're growing jobs in exactly the areas we don't want them, and the sectors that actually make things, the manufacturing sector, the construction industry, wholesaling, mining, drilling, the people who do the business services, even the technology sector, those aren't growing as fast as the government is in terms of hiring.
The Democrats have proposed a series of tax increases over the course of this year, especially on the wealthy people earning more than $400,000 a year. What's your opinion on this solution to reducing the deficit?
Well, first of all, it has been the Democrat line that they are not going to increase taxes. That for the last 5 or 6 years, they were saying we're not going to raise taxes on anyone who makes less than $400,000. The problem with that, of course, is that inflation is a tax. And so the people who've borne the brunt of the Biden policies have been middle-class families that are really financially squeezed. I mean, when you think about it, when you just reduce the value of the dollar, that's a tax on people who earn income and people who have saved money. And so I guarantee you the 95% of the people who've been really hammered by the inflation tax have incomes below $400,000. Look, my view is I want to see the United States with the best possible and most competitive tax system that we can achieve. I'm proud of what we did in 2017 when we brought down we had the highest business tax rate in the world. That wasn't a very smart policy. We lowered that. So I'm in favor of broadening the base of the tax system but also lowering the rates so that you don't have an uncompetitive situation.
Has Donald Trump released a concrete tax policy plan yet?
Well, we did that. It's funny because I've been asked that question a lot lately.
Yeah.
And by the way, I should add that you introduced me quite correctly as a former Trump economic advisor, but I'm also an advisor to the Trump campaign this year, just for full disclosure.
Okay.
And, we feel like we did a very sound and very successful tax plan that was passed by Congress in 2017. It was a big success. We brought a lot of capital back to the United States. It became like a magnet for capital and jobs by lowering the rates and making America a more attractive place for people to invest in. So we went from having the highest corporate tax rate in the world to one that was actually slightly below the average. And boy, did that work. Very much like, the one country that's really growing in Europe right now is Ireland, and Ireland has the lowest corporate tax rate in Europe. Funny how those things work. If you tax something, you're going to get less of it, and you tax something less, you're going to get more of it. And so we really did fix a lot of the problems in the tax system. We made it much simpler. We doubled the standard deduction so that most families now only 9% of American tax filers now have to itemize their deductions. So now you can just check a box and you take the standard deduction, which is more generous, and those kind of things really worked. And we also reduced the small business tax, which really helped the backbone of our economy, which is small businesses. So now when Trump wins, and I think Trump will win the election, I think he's going to come in and we're going to make some change. We're certainly going to make those tax cuts that we passed in 2017 permanent. And that's really going to be one of the central battles between Kamala Harris and Trump. I mean, Kamala Harris wants to eliminate a lot of those tax cuts. We want to make them permanent. And then Trump has talked about things like not taxing tips. He's talked about not taxing Social Security benefits. I happen to be in favor of both of those ideas. We want to make sure that the death tax is not confiscatory. So we want to limit the number of people who have to pay the death tax. Those are the kinds of, so I would say that mostly we'll be kind of trying to repair the tax system in ways that work for the American people.
Here's an article from CNBC dated June, so 2 months ago. Trump floats eliminating U.S. income tax and replacing it with tariffs on imports. Apparently, according to this article, Trump, in the meeting with GOP lawmakers at the Capitol Hill Club in Washington, D.C., also talked about using tariffs to leverage negotiating power over bad actors. According to another source in the room, basically, it's discussed that he was flirting with the idea of eliminating income taxes and using tariffs or raising tariffs to supplement. Is this actually in the works? Can you comment on this?
No, it's not. Look, many times Trump, says things that everyone takes him literally. But what he was saying, because I've talked to him about this, is that we could use some of the tariff money. And by the way, I'm not necessarily a big fan of tariffs, so I should tell you, audience, that I'm a free trade guy. I understand the important dynamics of having open trade. The whole idea of trade since Adam Smith is that both parties benefit when they trade voluntarily with each other. But if you are going to have a uniform tariff, like a 10% tariff, what Trump was saying is we'll use the revenues from that tariff, or some of them, to reduce other taxes so that the overall tax burden is not necessarily significantly raised.
Okay, so you say you're a free trader. Fundamentally, what is wrong with tariffs?
What is wrong with tariffs?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question, because, if you're going to, let's say you had a 10% across the board tariff, would that be the end of the world? No. In fact, if, for the first 125 years of this country, the major source of revenue for the United States government was tariffs. Did you know that? Most people don't know that, but we didn't have an income tax. We collected money on tariffs. Now, I would much rather see tariffs than income taxes. Income taxes are the worst way to raise revenue because they punish people for their success. So I think if you're going to have a low flat tariff, that's not such a terrible policy. What I really object to, though, is things like protectionist tariffs, like we're going to protect the steel industry, or we're going to protect the car industry, or we're going to, impose tariffs on green energy that's imported from other countries. Those never seem to work. We've tried to protect the steel industry and the aluminum industry and the auto industry, and even with the tariffs, we really haven't been able to save a lot of jobs in those industries. So I would like to see if we're going to have a tariff, I like the low flat rate and make it uniform on everyone. I don't like the government picking winners and losers.
Protectionist policies, are you referring to specifically, let's say, tariffs on Chinese imports, for
Yeah.
example? Okay. Those do more harm than good. Is that what you're saying?
Well, see, this is the thing. I happen to think that tariff that Trump is onto something in terms of China. I think China is clearly an enemy of the United States. I think they're a dangerous country. I think that they are engaged in predatory trade practices. I think they're manipulating their currency, and I also think that they're a danger to the United States and the rest of the world in terms of the way they are building up their military. There's a lot of talk about let's hope it doesn't happen. But China trying to invade Taiwan and moving into India and other countries. So this raised the question of, do you want to have free trade with a country that is an enemy of yours? And that's a good question. I don't know the answer to it, but I know that Trump uses tariffs very effectively as a weapon against other countries. I've seen it firsthand where he used the threat of a tariff against, say, Mexico or the Europeans or China to force other countries to do things that are in America's interest. And if he can do that and pull it off, then I'm all for it.
Let's good segue into foreign policy now. You use the word enemy to describe China. Very strong word, but you're not alone. This is an NBC article. It says over 40% of Americans now see China as an enemy, a 5-year high, a Pew report finds. Half of Americans think of China as a competitor, and only 6% consider the country as a partner, according to the report. This wasn't always the case, as you know. At what point did relationships start to sour?
Well, maybe I shouldn't have used the word enemy. I think, I stand corrected. I really should say that they're an adversary, not an enemy.
Okay.
I think that
What's the difference? What's the difference here in your
I think that
opinion?
they are a danger to the United States in terms of both their predatory trade practices and also the fact that there's no question they're building up their military, they're saber rattling. It seems like they certainly want to take Taiwan. As I said, and I'm not a national defense expert. I'm just saying that I would put China in a separate category of countries that are friendly to the United States. So, for example, I'm a big fan of the North America free trade zone. I think we should have all of North America, from Mexico down to Canada, be one big free trade zone. And so China, though, is a country that all Americans are very concerned about what they're doing in Tiananmen Square. And frankly, that the freedom revolution in China that started in the early to mid 1980s has really reversed course, and it's become a more repressive regime in China as well.
Has Trump stated any significant deviations from his foreign policy outlook or strategies from when he was running in 2016?
I'm sorry. Has he?
Has this changed his outlook on foreign policy now versus when he was running back in 2016?
I'm not comfortable answering that question because I don't advise him on foreign policy.
Okay.
So I'd rather stick to the economics.
Okay, no problem. On the topic of monetary policy, let's just go back to monetary policy. Do you think that the Federal Reserve should continue to lower rates into 2025? Have you looked into that issue?
So my philosophy about the Fed, and this is now I'm speaking for myself, not necessarily, and certainly not for Donald Trump in this instance.
Yeah.
I am very much in favor of and as you may know, I was nominated by Trump to be on the Federal Reserve Board, although I didn't make it through the process.
Sure.
But I really believe that we need a price rule. In other words, I think it's really destabilizing for the world economy and the U.S. economy that the Fed makes up these rules as they go along. We should, for example, one of the rules that I would, if I were running the Fed, I would say, look, we're just going to follow commodity prices. And if commodity prices are rising, that means there's too much inflation in the economy. And if commodity prices are falling, then we should ease up on, we should have more money. There's all sorts of different price rules you could use. You could use a gold standard. You can use nominal GDP as your standard. But what I'm saying is that by the Fed just making up the rules and no one knowing what they're going to do next is a destabilizing influence to the economy. So I want the Fed to just basically say, okay, we're going to stay at two. Our target is 2% interest. I mean inflation, and if we go above that amount, then we have to, raise rates, and if we go below that amount, we have to lower rates, and not make it so that the Fed chairman makes the rules as they go along. And I think that would be so much better for the world economy. Look, the U.S. dollar is the world reserve currency. Everything revolves around the dollar. And the problem is when we have an unstable dollar, as we've had under Biden and under Jerome Powell, it not only negatively affects the United States economy, it negatively affects the whole world economy.
I've been reading that Trump's running mate J.D. Vance has advocated for a weaker dollar to boost trade. Is that something you can comment on? Is that true? First of all,
I'm not in favor of a weaker dollar. I look, and I say this respectfully. I mean, I'm a great fan of the President Trump, but I think that we benefit from a strong but a stable dollar. And the problem is that what you've got is there's no question that, for example, the yen and the yuan have been manipulated by the Japanese and the Chinese governments to try to increase their exports. And that's a problem. We need to try to make sure that countries aren't using currency manipulation as a way to increase their trade.
So you don't support the idea of the U.S. also engaging in any sort of manipulative practices to change the currency for trade purposes?
I do not. I think what we want to do is something very simple, that make the dollar as good as gold. And make it stable in value. That's why you have a currency. What's the purpose of a currency? Let's go back to Economics 100. The purpose of a currency is to retain its value and to be a medium of exchange. Well, if the dollar is fluctuating up and down, it loses. It loses two of its great functions as a currency.
Can you comment on Trump's announcement that he would implement a Bitcoin strategic reserve? Senator Loomis, for example, recently proposed a legislation to actually put this into practice. What's your opinion on what this would do to the economy?
I'm not really a big fan of that. I'm glad that Donald Trump very robustly embraced cryptocurrencies. I think cryptocurrencies are really important, and I think they're a safeguard against runaway central bankers. You can tell I'm not a big fan of the central bankers of the world. That I think they're arrogant. I think they're out of control. They have too much power. And so the great thing about cryptocurrencies is they create a competitive private currency, and that takes away power from central bankers. And so if the central bankers try to inflate currencies and so on, people will have an alternative. The money will flow into these cryptos. Now, look, I personally am not a big owner of cryptocurrencies. I have some Bitcoin, but not a lot. But I am very pleased that we have these alternatives, and I'm also pleased that Donald Trump endorsed them.
Before we talk about your book, then, do you think that the dollar would change, either strengthen or weaken under Donald Trump, just based on his policies on trade and taxes? Yeah.
Well, that's a good question, and I don't know if I can give you a good answer to that, because Trump, you're right. The Trump does tend to favor a weaker dollar. It's one of the issues that I disagree with him on. I want the dollar to be stable. And so I don't favor a weaker dollar. I favor a dollar that's worth a year from now what it's worth today. And incidentally, when you have inflation of 20%, that's just all inflation is a way to devalue the currency, right? It just means you've got more dollars out there and fewer goods chasing those dollars. So I would like to see an inflation rate that's very stable at 1 or 2 or 3%. And a dollar that, and incidentally, there's a reason why the dollar is the world reserve currency. It's because it's the currency that investors all over the world have the most trust in. And the way I always put it is that the dollar is the least rotten apple in the cart. So I don't want to ever see the United States lose its status as the world reserve currency.
Well, just for the record, when Trump was president, when he took office in January 2017, the dollar was around 101, the DXY index. When he left by 2020, it was still around the same level. It had gone down during his presidency and then went back up. So during those 4 years, it didn't move that much, actually. If you just
that's a pretty stable.
4-year period.
That's it.
So
I wasn't aware of that statistic, but if you're right about that, then that is kind of what you want, is a dollar that's remains stable.
tell us about your book that's coming up in September. You told us you were working on a new book. It's coming out. Yeah.
Well, look, I think I'm obviously a little biased because I work for Trump, but I think this is an incredibly impactful election. I mean, you basically got Trump on Venus and Kamala Harris is on Mars. They could not be more different in terms of their economic outlook and what they want to do. So, you're going to see much bigger government, much more of this green energy spending. You're going to see much more, probably higher taxes on wealthy, which never works. And under Trump, he's much more of a pro-business guy. He comes from the business community. He knows how businesses work. So it's going to be a really important election in terms of whether the American people, would move. I mean, if Kamala Harris wins, she will be, the most liberal president probably in American history. And so, the polls have it a tight election. I expect Trump would win, but anything can happen in American politics. Now, my book is just about, how almost all of the economic statistics that, measurements of performance. I look at, I think, the 24 major measures, everything from employment to inflation to gas prices to small business confidence to interest rates, to mortgage rates, all sorts of things. And on something like, 22 of those 24 measures, Trump's performance has been superior to the performance of Biden and Kamala Harris. So if I do think if this election comes down to who do you think is better to handle the economy, I think Trump will win handily. If the election is about Trump's behavior, or if it's about abortion or social issues, then that Kamala Harris could win. So my main point of that book is to remind people that we had one of the best economies ever when Trump was president. If it had not been for COVID, he would have won a 40-state reelection landslide. And so it's really about what he achieved and what's at stake in this election.
Okay, so your book is called, I believe, Trump Economic Miracle, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the Trump Economic Miracle.
The Trump Economic Miracle. When does it come out exactly? So we can look out for that.
It's supposed to come out, fingers crossed here, it's supposed to come out on September 30th.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate you coming on the show and educating us. And where else can we learn from you and follow your work besides your book?
Thank you for asking. So the last point I'd like to make, and I so much appreciate the opportunity to come on your very successful show, is that if people want to, I put out what we call a hotline every morning. It's an email and it's absolutely free. It costs nothing. All you have to do is just sign up for it. And you can read it in 5 minutes every morning. It's just a little 5 or 6 bullet points about the economy and the political situation. And to get that, just go to unleashprosperity.com. That's unleashprosperity.com and just sign up for it. And as I said, it's free. It doesn't cost you anything. And we hope that people will get it. It's been very popular. I know Donald Trump reads it every morning.
Okay. All right. We'll put the link down below so you can read what Donald Trump reads every morning. Thank you very much, Steve. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
We'll speak again soon. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.